followed our virtual programs over the past couple of years. Sam has done a couple programs for us. He did one last year, I believe. Maybe it was the year before. You know, pandemic time gets a little fuzzy. You did one, I believe, on industrial policy. And then Sam is also the author of a fantastic book called Challenging China, which he did online for us a couple of years back. Sam is the director of the Center of Excellence for Global Trade and Supply Chain Management, which is a big mouthful, but does amazing work. Based in Seattle, they connect industry and education in Washington around workforce development issues. Well, he was also previously the president of the Trade Development Alliance of Greater Seattle, where he organized trade and business missions to China and hosted countless delegations, business people, government officials, and others from China. Prior to his role at TDA, he worked as a legislative assistant specializing in foreign affairs and trade issues for now retired U.S. Rep. John Miller. And he has been published in the World Bank's Urban Age magazine and numerous other publications. He also wrote and co-produced the short, dark comedy about customer service titled Please Hold, and is the author of a novel titled Munsrat Lives. Let's give Sam Kaplan a big hand.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for the kind introduction, Tim. I didn't realize I was being part of something Great Decisions that's older than I am, 1953. That's incredible. Honored to be here and honored to talk to you all about. There's certainly no dearth of things we need to decide right now. As we wade into whether and how the U.S. should restrict trade with China, and if such policies are effective, we all read about, it's important we frame the larger challenge of China correctly. Specifically, I want to talk about how Jonathan Chinas, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, the person who wrote the article, how he framed it in his article. Did everybody read the article? At least had ChatGPT summarize it for you, at least, hopefully. It's a good article, but Chinas asserts that U.S. worries are all about our becoming less powerful militarily and economically. The U.S. and other countries are not worried about China merely because the U.S. is less powerful militarily and economically. We're worried because China's government has become more authoritarian. It's far more oppressive to the Chinese people, from arresting activists of all stripes, to more censorship, including of the internet, to wiping out the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And at the same time, China has become more expansionist, certainly in the South China Sea, where there's been all sorts of different things happening in recent months and years. Bhutan, where China's been seizing territory. Taiwan, where it's been flying over its territory and just recently been putting warships just off of Taiwan. To perhaps most important, trying to change the old liberal rules-based order into one that would make the world safe for authoritarianism. This is why countries are concerned, including the United States, but also Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and others. Let me try and illustrate this. So let's imagine that South Korea has a population of 1.3 billion instead of its actual current 52 million. But they still are a democracy, still have their civil society, have a successful economy, and the boy band BTS still rules the hearts of young people everywhere. Undoubtedly, this imaginary, larger, still economically successful South Korea would work to exert its influence around the world. Large countries do that. And South Korea might have ideas how they want to transform the World Trade Organization, WTO, or on things like digital technology standards. The United States and other countries around the world might agree or disagree with South Korea, but we probably wouldn't be trying to prevent them from doing a bunch of stuff and having a coalition to counter that South Korea. And that's because South Korea, a liberalized democracy, wouldn't be a threat to the world. They may want to make changes to the international order, but it's unlikely they'd be ones that would be inimical to a liberal world order. It's unlikely a liberalized democracy, even this imaginary 1.3 billion people, South Korea, would be trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism. So I would frame the challenge differently than the author of the article did. And we need to deal with the world as it is. And that world is one where a more authoritarian, more expansionist China is a large country with a large economy. It's the second largest in the world, or the largest in the world if you calculate it using purchasing power parity GDP, as you can see in these two charts here on the slides. It's also the largest export in the world, accounting for nearly 15% of global exports. That's almost twice as large as the share of the United States or Germany, the other export powerhouse in the world. China is a leading trading partner with far more countries around the world than the United States is. That gives China a lot of sway and influence around the world. And perhaps most important for today's discussion, China is the world's largest manufacturer. It accounts for nearly a third of all manufacturing. China, some have called it, is the factory for the world. Now, over the last 20 years, it has moved up the value chain in doing manufacturing. It's no longer just making shoes and clothing and toys. Today, it also makes all sorts of high-tech goods, everything from electric vehicles to high-tech machine tools. Now, because China is more authoritarian and more expansionist, this new capability is why the United States and other countries are looking at what the author, Jonathan Chanis, in the piece that we mostly all read, what he called technological denial. But even as this is happening, China has entered a new transition, a new stage of their economic development. China has at least three big economic challenges that it's dealing with. One that's been increasingly getting a lot of attention in the news in recent months and years is its aging demographics. China's fertility rate is now down to 1.3. South Korea is just about the only other country in the world with a lower fertility rate. South Korea is not going to get to 1.3 billion people anytime soon. And China's fertility rate has been on decline really since the 1990s, but for the last 7 years especially, it started to plunge, as you can see in this chart on this slide, since 2016. And in the last 2 years, China's population has actually gotten smaller. Its working age population, people from about age 15 to 60, that's been getting smaller over the last 7 years. This is one of the reasons why China's GDP growth rate has slowed in the last couple of years. GDP growth comes from an increase in the working age population and from an increase in productivity. So again, its working age population has been decreasing, and its productivity increases have been decreasing also over the last decade. Of course, a lot of different countries are experiencing lower fertility rates, but the United States, Japan, Europe, and other places that are having this happen, they're already rich. What's happened to China is, as people have been saying, they've gotten old before they've become rich. So second, China has been overly reliant on real estate in its economy. Xi Jinping has been rightly trying to deflate that bubble, but that's a difficult thing to do, and it's a dangerous thing to do for your economy. Around 70% of the wealth of urban Chinese households has been in real estate, and even the rest of their financial assets are tied up indirectly with real estate. So when real estate values have been falling, which they have been the last few years, and the value of companies related to real estate have fell, China's middle class has really felt it. Again, China is purposely trying to deflate this real estate bubble, but that will take a while to unwind. And again, it's a dangerous endeavor. The other big challenge of the real estate bubble is that it has stressed local and provincial governments. These governments derive much of their revenue from land sales, which was great when property was doing well, but now that property market is doing badly, their coffers of these and revenues for these local and provincial governments is having a lot of trouble. That's where a lot of the debt in China exists, is at the local and provincial level. And that gets to the third big challenge, which is debt. So China's debt to GDP ratio is now nearly 300%. For years, China's economy grew at high rates, in part due to large investments. But increasingly, that investment is less productive. For each won of investment China's been made, that's increasingly led to a lower rate of GDP growth. Now, a lot of people have been speculating that Xi Jinping and China's government are going to introduce large stimulus to get their economy going again. Goldman Sachs just said that last week. They've been saying it for years now, and it has yet to actually happen. And Xi Jinping is trying to get China into a new era. He's aware of the difficulties with the debt issues. And he's essentially an old-style conservative Republican as well. He talks a lot about, quote, welfarism. And he's talked about how when he was young, he's an old man, he went through hard times as a youth during the Cultural Revolution. And he says it made him stronger. He seems to think that China's youth today need to go through some hard times. So China's economy has a lot of headwinds. And I predicted in my book that Tim mentioned that came out a couple of years ago, that China would start having lower GDP growth. And I was right on that. I've got to pat my back at least once about my book during a speech. Of course, China still claims that it has high GDP growth. A couple of weeks ago, they announced that in 2023, last year, they had 5.2% GDP growth. And crazily, a lot of people believe that number. I'm thinking of hiring China to come out and make an announcement that I'm 6'2", I look like Brad Pitt, and I'm a billionaire. So China is not growing at 5.2% as it claims. If it isn't, what is its actual growth rate? Well, fortunately, the research organization Rhodium Group recently broke this down. What they did is they looked at the various components of GDP: investment, government spending, consumption, and net exports. And they noted, as you can see in this chart, that China invested about $2 trillion less in the real estate sector than it did a year ago. And they then looked at other investments in other sectors, and it appears that investment added no GDP growth in 2023 to China's economy. And then they looked at government spending. The central government, despite many expecting it to, as I said, has not done a lot of stimulus spending. The modest spending increases by the central government have been offset by the local governments who, as I mentioned before, they can't do land sales, so they don't have revenues, so they aren't able to spend more. The shin bone is connected to the knee bone, but that shin bone has been kicked hard in the last couple of years. So GDP growth is not getting anything from government spending. And then there's household spending, another component of GDP. There's been some modest increases in household spending in China, but not as much as people expected, and certainly not as much as they expected after the end of the zero COVID policy. They've been modest, and there's been a fair amount of unemployment as well. The Chinese middle class is not really doing that great. So that leaves net exports as the last component of GDP. After growing rapidly during the pandemic, it's leveled off. So if you put all these components together, Rhodium estimates that China's economy grew about 1.5%, not last year's 5.2% that China claims. That means, by the way, the United States probably grew 3% in 2023. The official numbers aren't out. If so, then the United States economy grew twice at the rate of China's economy last year. So China's economy has slowed down, but it's still a high-tech, innovative economy. There's a stereotype that China steals intellectual property, and they do steal intellectual property, but they're also very innovative. Despite all of its challenges, China has one of the most technologically advanced economies in the world, capable of creating innovations at far more than many other countries. It's a leader in AI, clean energy, quantum computing, and in a variety of other industries. So China does steal intellectual property, but for at least a decade, it's been creating plenty of its own intellectual property. So China's more authoritarian, it's more expansionist, and it has a large economy, depending on how you measure, number 1 or 2. It's facing large economic challenges, and its economic growth was lower last year than the United States. And I estimate that it'll grow at a low rate going forward, probably about the same rate as the United States and Europe. So what do we do about it in terms of trade policy? There should be at least 3 big goals in thinking about trade policies with China. 1 is diversifying global supply chains to make them more resilient. 2 is keeping ourselves safe in strategic areas. And 3 is asking whether this policy will help encourage liberalization in China. Now, during the pandemic, people kept saying global supply chains are fragile. But when they say that, they're leaving out a key phrase. They're fragile compared to what? What if each country during the pandemic was doing everything themselves? Or just in general in society, all these countries were trying to build everything themselves, and then some sort of emergency happened, a pandemic or an earthquake or something else that shut down these countries' farms and factories. Well, then these countries would be desperately trying to trade with other countries to get these goods and food. But there wouldn't have been global supply chains in place to help get those goods and food to them, and that would have been disastrous. In addition, in such a system, we'd all have less choice, and our goods would be more expensive. So despite people saying global supply chains are fragile, they're actually much more sturdy than the alternative, and they did all right in the pandemic, better than people think. But that's not to say that global supply chains are perfect or that they were in the best shape during the pandemic. They do need to diversify to become more resilient. And part of the problems during the pandemic is there's too much reliance on a just-in-time model for global supply chains. But the other problem was we were reliant really on too many goods and too many components of goods from one country in China. So there are resilience reasons to try and diversify global supply chains. Now, global supply chains have been diversifying slowly for a while, and that's because as China became more expensive, some components and products started shifting to lower cost places. I think I've told this before in this group that I go to Vietnam fairly often, and when I was there a number of years ago, I visited a factory, and this factory had moved from southern China to Vietnam in 2014. So remember, that's long before the US trade war and long before the pandemic. Things were moving out of China because the cost in China had been rising. So there had been already some slow diversification of global supply chain, but a lot of this was sort of final assembly and lower value goods. But then the pandemic hit. China's zero COVID policy, which included shutting down cities and millions of people and factories that were producing goods that other countries were buying, this interrupted global supply chains severely, and it had a profound effect on how businesses view China. I don't think even today that people realize how the zero COVID policy really changed how businesses are viewing China. It was okay if China was committing genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, arresting hundreds of human rights activists and cracking down on feminists. But when these global supply chains and doing business in China became unreliable, that was a bridge too far for these companies. And so since the middle of 2022, we've seen companies plan for and change their global supply chains in a much more robust way. In fact, just about every company I've been talking to over the last year and a half since that happened, they're either planning to move production out of China or already have moved some production out of China. And you've started to see this China plus one strategy by companies, even if they don't trumpet it publicly, where for products that they're going to sell into China, they're still keeping those factories in China. But for products they're going to sell outside of China, they're starting to move factories to build those things outside of the country. And companies that are sourcing components from China, they're increasingly working to source from a variety of different places, not just from China. And of course, India, now the most populous country in the world, and one which has become more productive and whose economy is growing faster than China's, is playing a larger role in the global supply chains and aims to play an even larger role going forward. Some people dispute the fact that global supply chains have been diversifying and diversified even more since the zero COVID policy. I was actually in a vigorous discussion with someone from the Council on Foreign Relations a week or so ago. He's a big data nerd, and he was pointing out to me there's no sign of what he calls decoupling, or what I call diversification, when you look at China's exports. He says they've been going up and up for the last 5 years. Well, it's true for the last 5 years. If you take that starting point 5 years ago, China's exports are up, but that's the wrong time frame to look at. As I said, what really happened is in the middle of 2022, companies started getting skittish about China because of the zero COVID policy. And that's when they really started to make changes. If you look at exports from China to the United States, as you can see in this chart here, they started to go down in the last year. Supply chains don't just change overnight. It's going to take a while to move factories. As you've seen, also exports from places like Mexico to the United States have gone up. So you're starting to see the changes, but you're not going to see drastic changes overnight. This Council on Foreign Relations guy and others claims that actually this decrease in exports from China and increase of exports from places like Mexico and Vietnam, that's just goods transiting through there from China. I use stronger words with him than I will with you, but it's really only a tiny, tiny part of goods are just transiting through Mexico and Vietnam and other countries. They're doing the final assembly now, or some other value is being added to the products as they go through their countries. And just like 20 years ago, China started off with lower value goods and then worked up the value chain. Places like Mexico and Vietnam are also likely to do that. And we can see this because China's exports, as you can see in the top left and top right, to places like Mexico and Vietnam, they didn't go up a lot last year. In fact, it doesn't come close to matching the decrease of exports from China to the United States. So it's not a gigantic shift, but it's only again been about a year since companies really started to change because of the zero COVID policy. These things will take a while to work their way through. Again, I talk to companies all the time. There's one company I talked to, they're planning to have a factory in North America for the first time. In the past, all their factories have been in Asia. Companies are looking to invest in Mexico. If you look at the bottom in the middle slide there, that red line is investment in Mexico, which has gone way, way up over the last year. That is probably a lot of companies investing to build factories in Mexico. So you'll start to see it reach the trade data sometime soon. We'll see over the next 2 to 5 years whether I'm right or the Council on Foreign Relations guy is right. Now, certainly also companies could change their minds too for other reasons, but we'll see what happens. So there's been some progress in diversifying global supply chains, but another aspect of trade policy we need to worry about is China having the advantage in strategic areas, which is what this article really got into as part of the Great Decision series. This includes semiconductors, but also aspects of technology needed for the green transition that's taking place, including batteries, solar panels, and increasingly electric vehicles. It's a complicated issue, and some of the questions we need to consider when looking at it are, what are we doing with our trade restrictions? How effective are they? And what are the unintended consequences? Let's look at semiconductors briefly to kind of unwind some of this. When we talk about semiconductors, we have to distinguish between the different types of semiconductors. So for semiconductors greater than 45 nanometers, between 28 and 45 nanometers, and between 10 and 22 nanometers, a lot of different countries make these. But for the most sophisticated semiconductors, those less than 10 nanometers, this is the area really where China and the US are concerned, and Europe and other places. There's only 2 places that make these kinds of sophisticated semiconductors. Samsung in South Korea, which makes about 10%, and TSMC in Taiwan, which makes the overwhelming majority, about 90% of these types of semiconductors. Now, semiconductors are crucial components of so many different things nowadays, including automobiles, cars. Your average car has more than 1,000 semiconductors in it now. You're essentially driving a computer on wheels. But they're also in military equipment. So those missiles that have been killing civilians in Ukraine, they're driven by software and by semiconductors, the Russian missiles. Or you've probably read about the Houthis in launching missiles in the Red Sea. Similarly, those are semiconductors and software that's driving that. So the US put restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductors and semiconductor equipment, semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. These include the kind of chips I talked about earlier, specifically though for AI, military applications, and surveillance. So semiconductor chips used for that. And restrictions were also placed in manufacturing equipment for making the most advanced semiconductors. There's a Dutch company called ASML. They essentially make all of the advanced equipment that allows you to make these kind of semiconductors. The US also put a number of Chinese companies on what's called an entity list, including a company called Huawei. By being on this list, these companies are barred from receiving certain types of technology, including advanced semiconductors. And we've also restricted US companies from investing in China in certain parts of the semiconductor industry. This probably seems reasonable to many of you. It seems reasonable to me, but there's complications. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the export controls complication. So the US announced with great fanfare export controls, but the devil, as always, is in the details. The Bureau of Industry and Security is charged with administering export controls. And the announced controls, if you read about them in the newspaper, they sounded very restrictive. But in practice, lots of these chips and equipment have been getting exceptions. So these companies will apply for an exception to the Bureau of Industry and Security. And more often than you might realize, they get that exception and they're able to sell to China. Another issue is that these export controls are generally announced about a year in advance of their actual implementation. So what happens? Well, you can probably guess. Chinese companies start buying up like crazy these semiconductors and this equipment before the implementation of the export controls. And these companies sell like crazy to get their money before the implementation of the controls. And you can kind of see this on this graphic that's from The Economist magazine. The share of revenue from Chinese sales for companies like ASML and others, they shot up before the implementation of the export controls. If the US was serious about these restrictions, we probably wouldn't have gone about it the way we have, which makes you think maybe we're not that serious, or maybe we're incompetent, or maybe this is for politics or some other reason. Then there's the question of whether, even if the restrictions were being implemented smartly, whether they would be effective. Now, there's some in industry who argue that these restrictions, all they're going to do is reduce revenue for US and other countries' companies and shrink their markets, and thus harm their success, their future success. And they also say that these restrictions, all they do is encourage China to double down even more in their efforts to build up their own semiconductor industry. And there's no doubt that the industry makes this argument in for self-interested reasons, but there's plenty of economists and policymakers who also make this argument. So we shouldn't just dismiss it just because industry is saying this. And indeed, China is spending billions of dollars to build up its semiconductor industry. Lots of this spending has been inefficient, but not all of it. And China has done this with many industries over the years, throwing huge sums of money to build up what they decide is strategic industry, as you can see from this chart, and everything from software, tech hardware, cars, and yes, semiconductors. In some of these sectors, they've been very successful at building up the industries, and others less so. The counter argument to industry, and some economists saying technological denial and trade restrictions won't work, is that China will certainly continue to build up its semiconductor industry, but our actions will ensure it's always a step behind us, behind the most sophisticated semiconductors that, again, only TSMC and Samsung currently make. And we're going to build up our own capacity. So by doing these restrictions and this denial, the idea is we'll always keep China at least one technology generation behind. As you can see in this hot headline, Huawei, the company I mentioned earlier, it's a controversial Chinese telecommunications and technology company. They late last year claimed a big breakthrough in creating a sophisticated semiconductor chip. This announcement was disputed by a number of experts, but time will tell. Will China be able to build up their industry and start building these high-tech equipment? So that's semiconductors. There's also items like batteries, which, as you can see from this chart, China dominates in. The Biden administration is working to encourage a far more robust domestic battery industry. And one of the ways they're doing this is with a whole series of Buy American provisions. Any goods purchased with taxpayer money have to contain 75% US-made content. Plus, defense contractors can't use Chinese-made batteries. And in addition, the administration, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, has been doing all sorts of subsidies to encourage Americans to buy electric vehicles. But these subsidies are contingent in part on those cars having domestically produced batteries. I'm not going to go into detail on batteries to save some time, but suffice it to say it's another big sector that the US is using trade restrictions to achieve its US policy goals. So that's the supply side, trying to stop China from supplying us and the rest of the world and being able to produce these kinds of strategic products and components. Let's talk about the demand side. And what I mean by that is, again, we're trying to restrict supplies of what we've deemed strategic products and components from being imported from China and trying to reduce their ability to produce them. But we're trying to provide the demand for these products ourselves by building up our own industries in these products domestically. Now, earlier in the Biden administration, Congress passed the CHIPS Act, which was designed to help the semiconductor industry. And then again, the Inflation Reduction Act, which contains all sorts of funding for upgrading our electric grid, solar panels, wind farms, and a bunch of other things. So a lot of people said, great, we've solved our problems. We're going to be spending large sums of money to revive our semiconductor industry and to build out our renewable energy industry. We're going to be at least a little bit like China in terms of trying to actively help our industries. But the question is it working? Was this just really a matter of spending money? Or are there other issues that hamper our industrial base and in general trying to build stuff here in America? Spoiler alert, there are some other issues that are affecting it. This gets to my final points. What are the most important things we should be doing to deal with a more authoritarian and more expansionist China? Again, that has a China that's an economy that's likely to not grow no faster than ours, and that will try to help encourage it to liberalize. First up is America's inability to build, much of it due to our poor regulatory environment and to our sclerotic bureaucracy. So let's go back to the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act led to a bunch of different announcements by companies that they're going to build semiconductor plants in the United States. TSMC said they were going to build 2 plants in Arizona. Intel was going to open one up in Ohio and Samsung one in Texas. Well, every single one of these facilities is delayed. TSMC's original announcement of a plant that was supposed to open this year, that's delayed now till at least 2025. And the other plant is delayed till at least 2027, probably more likely until 2028. This is going to affect what chips are made, where, and when. And the question is, will we really be able to stay a generation ahead of China? And similarly, the Intel plants, the Samsung plants are also delayed. So why are they all delayed? Well, everything takes too long and costs too much to build in America. You probably have seen it all around you here in Portland. I certainly see it up in Seattle. Housing, transit, roads, and now semiconductor plants, energy grids, solar and wind farms. All these things take too long and cost too much to build. For public infrastructure, it costs 2 to 3 times more to build in America and takes a lot longer to build than it does in Europe or Japan, with no commensurate benefits to either the environment or to labor. So, whoops, I forgot to advance the slide. I didn't want you to have to look at this ugly chart for too long. You're probably asking, what is this thing and why am I making you look at it? Well, it's the list of permits, applications, and reviews for Samsung's chip plant in Austin, Texas. This only represents the permits under the Clean Air Act's New Source Review Program. It doesn't include all the other permits, applications, and reviews Samsung's going to have to get in order to build that fab plant. And note that this list of only the New Source Review Program, it was so large I couldn't put it vertically. I had to flip it on its side to fit it on the slide. So one of the biggest obstacles to building anything in America nowadays is the regulatory environment. And that includes, for example, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So let's look at this quote from U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. She wants these semiconductor plants exempted from U.S. laws, from U.S. regulations. This is a cabinet secretary and perhaps the most liberal presidential administration of my lifetime, and she's complaining about environmental regulations. Instead of trying to exempt semiconductor plants from our crazy regulatory regime, it would be better to reform the system. We're here today, we're talking about strategic industries that we're competing with China on, but the current system is the root of many of America's problems, including homelessness. The reason housing is so expensive is because it's too difficult to build housing, long commutes and freight mobility. I could show you a bunch of charts showing that it's 2 to 3 times more expensive to build transit and roads in America and takes a lot longer, again, than it does in Europe and Japan, again, with no commensurate benefit to either the environment or labor. So I'm not arguing against protecting the environment. I'm here to tell you that we can do something like Europe has done and build stuff in a reasonable cost and a reasonable time and still protect the environment and still help labor. But it's not just NEPA, but a whole range of regulatory regimes. Here's data from an article in the American Affairs Journal. It details the various and myriad of laws and regulations that make it difficult to build in America. As you can see from the chart, it now takes a lot longer to build a fab, and consequently, fewer of them are being built. And virtually none of the money from the CHIPS Act that I mentioned earlier has been spent. The CHIPS Act authorized billions and billions, Carl Sagan amount billions of dollars, but only so far, only $37 million has actually been spent. And according to an article in Politico, and I'm going to quote from it, Congress, at the urging of the Biden administration, agreed in 2021 to spend $7.5 billion to build tens of thousands of electric vehicle chargers across the country. 2 years later, the program is yet to install a single charger. So why is that? It's again because the permitting, the zoning, and other regulations required to build these chargers and install them around the country. So we can restrict the transfer of technology and the sale of semiconductors and other strategic products to China all we want. But it won't matter unless we can develop and build the technology ourselves. And by the way, this inability to build doesn't just affect semiconductors, chargers, houses, roads, transit, and a bunch of other things. It also affects our military. It takes forever to develop and build new fighter jets, ships, and other military equipment. China has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. We have been smartly, in my opinion, supplying Ukraine with military equipment, but we have not been able to increase production enough that we don't have a shortfall of a bunch of military equipment, including for ourselves, for Ukraine, for Taiwan, and for other places. In fact, late last year, South Korea agreed to lend the US 500,000 shells to ease a shortage that we were having. We need to fix our regulatory and bureaucratic systems so that we can again build. That will be far more important than any trade policy we establish with China, important as those might be. Now, some of the delays with the TSMC plants are not about permitting and regulations, but disputes over labor. TSMC claims it needs to bring in specialized labor to build and to staff their fab plants. US labor strenuously disputes that, and I'm not going to referee that dispute, I'm not sure. But it does raise the other area where the US can gain a large advantage over China, immigration. The United States and many other countries are worried about China, but you know who else is? A lot of Chinese. Certainly wealthy Chinese, as you can see from the chart on the top left, they're leaving China at a high rate. High net worth Chinese are immigrating at high levels, more than Russians, more than Indians, more than other countries. And many educated Chinese want to leave China as well. The United States should be welcoming these immigrants to our country. Study after study has shown the net benefit America receives from immigrants. They start new companies. They add talent to current companies. They pay more into the social safety net than they take out, and they commit crimes at a lower level, much lower level than native-born Americans. We would be helping our country, and through the brain drain out of China, we would be retarding its progress in technology in everything from AI to semiconductors. China has a low fertility rate, but the United States has a lower fertility rate now too. It's much higher than China's, but it's now below replacement level. So without immigration, our population would start to decrease as well. A policy where Chinese students studying in the United States are allowed to stay and work, where we increase H-1B visas so more Chinese engineers and scientists can come to America, would be a far more effective policy than trade restrictions, than technology denial, as necessary and as helpful as those might be. So trade restrictions, technology denial are necessary in some cases. In strategic industries, in areas that we need to build up military resilience and to hinder China's military buildup. There's a very good argument to me that we need more reciprocity in US-China trade relations. In areas where they close their markets and everything from e-commerce to internet search companies to autos and other areas, we should do the same until they agree to truly open up their markets. And something I have not mentioned at all today, but which is really important, is we need to do all of this in concert with our allies. Those Buy America provisions I talked about earlier, they gave a lot of concern to the EU. If we want to counter China, if we want to encourage it to liberalize, which is what our main foreign policy goal should be, a subject for another day, we need to do so multilaterally. But all of these policies will not be nearly as important as our tackling our own problems. Again, our crazy regulatory environment, our sclerotic bureaucracy, our inefficient military production, building up our talent pool by bringing in more immigrants, and including and especially from China, that strengthens our country and it weakens China's. It will encourage China to liberalize. That's what will truly make America not necessarily great again, but continue to improve and evolve upon the American dream. So thanks very much. I appreciate your time. Happy to hear questions, discussion, disagreements, vehement concerns, whatever you have out there.
Great. So we're going to move to questions. I want to remind you that a question is 30 seconds or less, has a question mark at the end of it. And we have a lot of people in the room who I'm sure have a lot of questions. So
you mentioned that Europe can build things and do things faster than the US. I think of Europe as older democracies, more bureaucratic, the EU very bureaucratic. How have they been able to accomplish that? Of just only regulations that are really important?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was just about a year ago now, I was in meetings with the EU with some port folks, and they definitely do have a big bureaucracy. But the difference in the way they work, they deal with environmental regulations as opposed to us is, so our system allows any one of us to have a big voice. You know, sort of an analogy, like if I want to do something, anyone in this room could just stand up, take this microphone and stop it, right? So if I want to build something through the NEPA and other regulations, we empower individuals to stop it. And in Europe, they don't do that. So they have regulations to protect the environment, but they give more power to larger groups rather than just individuals or individual organizations. So, you know, I can do a lawsuit to stop that solar farm that's going to be built down the road from me, or that semiconductor plant or whatever it may be. And that's why you have all those rules that I showed up on that screen, all these regulations, they're all designed to give more power to the individual. So that's really the difference between Europe and Japan as well. So it's not just Europe, but Japan also does this better. A lot of other countries can build faster than us, but what I like to compare Japan and Europe is they do a great job, maybe even better job in some ways in protecting their environment. And certainly Europe, you know, labor is more protected maybe than it is here in the United States. So you can have more efficient regulations and still protect things like the environment and labor rights.
Thank you for your remarks. Very, very insightful. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to the misperception or reality of decoupling in terms of how much leading U.S. companies are still dependent on China for profits. You mentioned the semiconductor manufacturing as an example, but also how much of our ag exports are still going and how important that is to middle America. How much of our, on the import side, I think Walmart and Amazon are now the largest employers in the US. And it seems that much of that stuff comes from China. So if you could just speak to the kind of the meat and potatoes of the relationship. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, a complicated question. I'll try and keep a relatively short answer on it. The first thing I'd say is people talk about decoupling, including about the Council on Foreign Relations person I referenced earlier, who's a smart, nice guy, by the way. I don't mean to disparage him. What really, people keep talking about the U.S. decoupling from China, but China decoupled from the United States before any of that happened. For years, they've been doing that. Certainly with the internet, with the Great Firewall, that was a decoupling from the United States and from the rest of the world. China instituted a number of years ago a dual circulation policy, which is designed to make them more independent. So they will be able to they will be able to import less and build more things domestically, but at the same time, they wanted to export more. So in a lot of ways, China's been decoupling from the United States for many years. We've started to talk about strategic decoupling, what I'd like to call diversification in recent years. Certainly in the Trump years, there was the trade war. In my opinion, we needed to push back on China. And even though I'm not a Donald Trump fan, I do think he did raise the China issue and made it a different issue. So maybe he deserves a tiny bit of credit to that. But the trade policies he did, remember, he didn't just do tariffs on China. He did tariffs on the EU and Japan and all of our allies, all these other countries. So it's not a very smart China policy. So then getting back to the reader question, we still import tremendously from China, but Mexico, we now import more from. I believe Canada is still our largest trading partner. But for a whole range of goods, we get a lot of components and a lot of finished goods from China. And to make this more global, because I talked about we need to be paying attention to the rest of the world more, not just the US-China relationship, Europe has started to catch on to this more in the last year or two, because China has become big in cars, especially electric vehicles. So if you look at the graph of electric vehicle exports to Europe, it is just going straight up. BYD and some other Chinese companies. And so now Europe is going, well, we can't have that. Before they were sort of trying to protect, they were not wanting to be too hard on China, certainly in Germany, because German car makers were selling a lot of cars in China. But now they're under threat. So you're starting to see Europe now trying to tackle some of the inequities between trade relationships between the two countries. There's other economists that talk about one of the big problems is China has subsidized its manufacturing sector and dampened households. And so really the big problem with why we have this imbalance in trade is because China has hurt your average Chinese. And so their incomes have not gone up the way they should. If you look at GDP per capita, China's GDP per capita is far lower than at the same stage where Taiwan's and South Korea and countries like that were. And so if you were able to help households in China more, they would spend more, and then hopefully they'd start to import more. Although again, they're trying to do everything domestically now in China, but that would help to balance the trade relationship and diversify the supply chain as well. So there's a lot of economists to talk about that.
So we have a question in the back, then we have a question on the web, and then we'll get to the other side of the room. Go ahead, Lance.
In Chinese development policy, they have a two-tiered system. One is the exports, but also there was supposed to be a increased push to develop domestic demand to take up any proportional slack. Could you comment on where that is now? And secondly, you were talking about local governments getting a lot of their income, especially past stimulus, from land sales, but they were also doing loans on land that they would then recycle to industries. Can you comment on the effects of that, given that now real estate is going down and those the security on those loans is less?
Yeah. So on the first question, China is trying to build up its local industries, and just as I said before, with their dual circulation policy, and there's this desire to try and be even more independent. And they've even doubled down on that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that not just the United States, but a whole host of countries have done on Russia. So China was looking at that and saying, okay, we want to make sure we can be resilient if, for example, we invade Taiwan, and or for some other reasons, countries want to put severe sanctions on China. And so they're wanting to go to the model that I said is much worse than the global supply chain model and makes countries much less resilient. It's really short-sighted on their part, in my opinion, and short-sighted on any country's part to think that they will be more resilient by trying to do everything in-house. But they are indeed doing that. There's that slide I showed earlier that shows the subsidies they've been providing in a whole host of industries, and including on agriculture. And during the U.S.-China trade wars and the Trump administration, that did help hurt our agricultural community. In fact, there's a new study that quantified that just came out earlier this week. I haven't read the whole thing, so I can't give you the exact figures in it, but it showed that we actually lost jobs, and it hurt a lot of our folks because of the tariffs that we did in the 2017 to 20 range. I know personally it's hurt agricultural companies because I work with some folks in the Eastern Washington. We used to export a lot of cherries to China. That's a high value item. You can charge a lot for it. You got to fly it because it's a perishable item, and they're delicious, of course. One of my favorite things of summer. But when we instituted tariffs, one of the things that China did, they often won't do tariffs. They'll just suddenly things won't get through. They'll do non-tariff barriers. And so those cherries weren't getting through. Very perishable item. It can't sit in the port or anywhere for a while. It just gets destroyed. So these cherry companies, these cherry growers had to find different places to export their cherries instead of China over the last 6 years. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out going forward. In terms of the debt issues, yes, so local governments get their money in a variety of ways. And as I said earlier, where a lot of the debt issues are at the local and provincial governments. And that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over the coming years. Just this week, a Hong Kong court ruled that they're going to basically take apart Evergrande, which was sort of the famous real estate company that's been having troubles and is basically broke. That's only one company. There's a bunch of other companies, probably a dozen other companies are in the same shape as Evergrande. What China's basically been doing is taking this failed loans and just moving them into different places. They had a organization called the China something Corporation, CIC. I'm completely forgetting the name of the organization now. They were putting a lot of bad loans 20 years ago into this organization. Now that's getting put into state banks. That's going to be folded under state banks. It was announced about a week or so ago. they're not really solving the issue in any of these things. They're just moving these bad loans to one place to another, and people are not getting paid back. They did say with Evergrande that local folks in China are going to get paid back. If you're a foreign investor, you're not getting your money. Now, at the same time that's happening, China, they were in Davos big time a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying, hey, China's open for business. They really want to get more investment back into China. I didn't show a chart, but you can see a chart showing lots of investment coming out of China, not going into China like it used to. Well, if you're someone who's owed a bunch of money in one of these failed places and you're getting screwed over, that's not going to encourage other people to go invest in there. Plus, of course, the stock market's been doing very badly in China recently, which is also dissuading investors to go there. So it's going to be a big problem. It's probably going to take a number of years for it to unwind, and it's going to cause, as I talked about earlier, low growth, low economic growth.
Sam, we're almost to the top of the hour, so we just have time for one last question from our those joining us on Zoom. Just to follow up, you talked about some of the challenges with building in the U.S. And for those who are interested in that, Ezra Klein has some really interesting columns and podcasts about this. Do you have one or two policy suggestions that are actually realistic that might help facilitate speeding this up?
Speeding up say that one more time.
Domestic building, like a chip factory, things like that.
Yeah,
I mean, what would be on your short wish list that would actually potentially happen?
So instead of trying to exempt things that we think are important from the regulatory regime, we need to reform it. And fortunately, there are attempts from the federal level to do that. There's actually some surprisingly bipartisan efforts, both Republicans and Democrats attempting to do that. But the latest Democratic bill, actually a proposal, it's not a bill yet, had a bunch of money, like billions of dollars, to support individuals and organizations who don't have the money to protest things, to allow them to protest. And someone online said this was the single worst reform idea they've ever seen for trying to help us build more. But there are efforts, and hopefully that won't make it through the process. And there are bipartisan. So we need to streamline, not even streamline, we need to take our regulations and make it so it's less difficult for me as an individual to stop building. This also needs to happen at the state and local level. And zoning, for example, in housing, I think Oregon's taken a big step, right? You passed a law to really make it easier in zoning to build different types of housing. That's important. So you have a lot of things in the local state level that need to happen as well. I know some of that might be controversial. I may have to run up to the border to get back to Washington. But trying to reform our regulations and support the folks in Congress that are trying to do that is very important. And stress, this is not something that's anti-environment. This is actually help environment. In fact, if you want to tackle climate change, if that's your biggest issue, well, we need to build more solar farms. We need to build charger stations. We need to build offshore wind. And we can't because of our current environmental regulations, ironically. So that's what I would do.
Sam, thanks very much. Audience, a round of applause for Sam. So we're wrapping up today. We will see you a week from today, same time, same place for the next 5 or 6 in a row here. A big thanks to Portland State on the way out. You can purchase a copy of the Great Decisions books or grab information about our fundraiser in April and the other information from other programs all on our website, worldoregon.org. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.